Alright, how's it going, y'all? Today I have in front of me the UniFi Enterprise 24 PoE Switch, which is a 2.5 gigabit capable PoE switch by UniFi. And so this video is going to be a little bit of everything. It's going to be a little bit of unboxing, a little bit of review, and really kind of looking at how much noise this thing creates, because I have heard a few different reviews from people saying that it is a little bit louder than they would like, especially in their house. And so that's actually where this is going for me. I'm going to be going through and cabling my entire house, and so I'll be having multiple ports in pretty much every single room. I'm actually going to be having more than 24 ports, which is how many this has, because I do plan on adding a 10 gig switch for the rest of the house. But for now, this is going to be serving the majority of the house probably for the next 6 months to a year until I kind of, well, save up and I don't need to spend all my money all at the same time, right? And so the reason I purchased this totally with my own money, is specifically because that 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports that are PoE. I really want to start testing out a lot more PoE access points, and I really want to be able to test out Wi-Fi 6's capability to honestly use the full 2.5 gigabit on there. Maybe it's not able to saturate a full 2.5 gigabit port, but they're definitely able to very easily saturate a 1 gigabit connection. And so I really would like to be able to test out some really fast Wi-Fi access points, because that's really what Wi-Fi 6 can bring to the table, especially when you have those 4x4 antenna configurations. You can get a lot of data transmitted through there. Now, one thing, currently UniFi's lineup only has 1 gigabit Wi-Fi 6 access points. I do really think that's going to change. If you look at their lineup, they're coming out with a lot more 2.5 gigabit things, and you've got to imagine they're coming out with the switches first and then the access points, but it's kind of hard to say sometimes. There's nothing out by them right now, but I think in the future that's got to change. It honestly also could just be a supply chain shortage thing, so you never really know. All right, well, let's go ahead and take this thing apart and start talking about some of the stats it's got. So you get your good old cable box. Ooh, and the nice pretty rack ears. I've always loved how UniFi has done this, though it's almost certainly a complete waste, but look how pretty those rack ears are. And it comes in this nice box. It's honestly overkill, especially when you've got people installing 50 of these because it's an actual enterprise switch. It's overkill and probably just wasteful. Then we've got the two rack ears. And then we have one of the nicest braided cables I've ever seen. It's not one of those plastic cables that you normally get. It's legitimately braided. It's kind of like what the Mac Pro has for its power supply. I was not expecting to see this, and I think it's way overkill considering this thing's just gonna live on a rack. But yeah, I'm probably actually gonna exchange this out and use a different normal power cable for it. But yeah, it's gorgeous. It is really nice for no reason whatsoever. And then finally, it's got that safety card that says, do not give this to children, there's plastic involved. Basically, it'll cause cancer only if you live in California, all those good things. And now on to the actual device. Okay, this is actually pretty cool how they've done the foam here. So it's a cut foam, so pretty much it goes, which is a very cool manufacturing way, and it's probably a little bit better for the environment rather than just a solid piece of foam, but it's very satisfying. All right, and now onto the switch. Comes in a nice little bag. All right, and here it is. And yeah, as you can see, it's pretty much identical to every other Gen 2 UniFi switch. You got your little screen here. It could have just been a barcode and would have been 95% as same effective, but it's nice to have the few times that you actually will use it. It might actually be really useful rather than having to go pull out your phone or anything. Really, the nice thing about it is it allows you to pull up a barcode on here that then allows you on the app to pull up AR and basically scan the barcode so it knows what switch you're on. And then it can tell you exactly what every single one of these ports is plugged into. And so you get a really cool AR map. And that's one of the best applications for AR that I've seen out of like a lot of mobile devices, because it really can be useful if you're like, okay, where is this cable going? I need to unplug this thing. Where is it? And that can really help you out. So I think that's an awesome feature, but you don't need the little OLED screen that costs way too much money for what it does and how often it's used. So the other thing right here is it's only got 2 SFP plus ports, which I kind of go back and forth on if that's a limitation of this device. So this switch has the exact same number of SFP plus ports, 2 of them, so that's 20 gigabit in aggregation, as the version of this switch that only has 1 gigabit. So it's the Pro 24. So it has 2 SFP plus ports, which is perfect for that. It's got a total of 24 gigabit of gigabit Ethernet ports, and it's got 20 gigabit of SFP plus. So pretty much you can have everybody running at the exact same time and nobody's going to be bottlenecked for the most part. There's 4 gigabit there, but that's never going to happen, right? Here, you actually start kind of hitting that limitation on 20 gigabit because these are 2.5 gigabit ports. At least half of them are. So that actually could be a much more of a limitation than would have been on previous switches. So the other thing you've got to think is, okay, you're getting a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. That's probably because you have a bunch of clients that are actually using more than 1 gigabit. So I kind of would have liked to see 4 ports on here, honestly, because that would have been 40 gigabit of throughput in aggregation, and this switch is capable of 42 gigabit, 2.5 times 12 plus 12 times 1 gigabit. So that honestly would have been a nice thing to have, because I do think some users are going to be able to actually saturate this thing, which is not something you really like to see. I'm not saying it's going to happen super often, and it's probably not a limitation for most people. It's not going to be for me because I just do not have that many 2.5 gigabit clients that are going to be accessing at the exact same time. But for a real enterprise switch, yeah, that's going to be a limitation. Because if you've got about half of your clients operating at full speed, you're now saturated. And so that's one thing you don't love to see. So I don't know. It really depends on to what your exact use case is. If you're going to be buying the switch, is that going to be an issue? They do have a bigger version of this model which has 4 ports. But yeah, you've really got to say, okay, is this going to be too much for me? Am I going to saturate it? And honestly, is that much of an issue? All right, and so as I said before, only half of these ports are 2.5 gigabit. So the first 12 right here are 1 gigabit, and it's got a nice little indication right here which ports are the 2.5 gigabit, but it is not all of them. And so let's kind of talk about value for money. And let's just say you really need a fast performing switch and you need a 10 gigabit connection, an SFP plus connection to this switch, and you need 24 devices. And you're also planning on going exactly with UniFi. So that gives you 2 options. There's this, and there is the 24 Pro. So the 24 Pro is about $100 cheaper than this one and has PoE plus, but it does not have any 2.5 gigabit. So I was pretty much in that boat. Honestly, it's overkill. I just wanted to have something that I can very much upgrade and work with. But the reason I chose this switch is it's only $100 more, and you're able to take advantage of the new 2.5 gigabit devices that are coming out. Buying 2.5 gigabit capable stuff is probably not the worst idea. You're starting to see a lot of laptops, a lot of standard motherboards on computers, all coming out with 2.5 gigabit because it's really not that much more expensive and gets you 2.5 times the performance. And so if you don't need to go up to 10 gigabit, and honestly not a lot of people do, 2.5 gigabit's a great standard. I mean, hey, where I live right now, I can actually buy 2 gig internet from Google Fiber. So if I wanted to pay an extra $30 a month, I've currently got the 1 gig connection from Google Fiber. I could get 2 gigabit and actually take advantage for a single device if you're just hitting the internet. Now, if you've got a video editing studio, that's a lot of what I set up for people, 2.5 gigabit's actually a pretty great sweet spot. You can easily handle multiple streams of 4K ProRes on a 2.5 gigabit connection. When I'm editing video, I'm very rarely ever saturating more than 2 gigabit of actual throughput when I'm playing back. When I'm rendering and exporting, I can actually hit that limitation. But for most people, really all you're caring about with your editing crew is being able to have everybody have nice smooth playback. And so that's where 2.5 gigabit can be awesome. It saves a ton of money on adapters as well as switches like this because 2.5 gigabit is so much cheaper to implement than 10 gigabit, and it gets you a lot of the same performance. Actually saturating a 10 gig connection is quite difficult unless you have good hardware, and so I really think a lot of people, and I wish a lot more NAS devices would come with 2.5 gigabit as the standard, because it's very easy to implement now. It is really becoming the standard for like slightly upgraded internet. And so I think honestly going for this 2.5 gigabit model, if you are looking to the future, is probably worth it. The one limitation this Switch does have that the other one does not, that 24 Pro, is this one does not have any PoE++ ports. Now that's either going to be a limitation for you or it's not. The only thing I could really see ever needing that PoE++, unless you have a special device that actually needs it, is if you want to have one of those breakout switches that UniFi has. It's called the USG Flex, I believe. It's where it can take in PoE++ as the input, and then it can divvy out PoE+ to 4 different ports. And if you're only feeding it PoE+, well, it's got that max cap in there. So if you have like 4 security cameras, maybe 4 security cameras is too much for PoE+. And so you would need that PoE++. That's the only thing I could really think about needing that. And for me, that's not what I'm planning on doing. I just have not seen that many PoE++ devices out there. And so in my opinion, if you're in the boat like me, which is why I purchased it, I would honestly just go for the 2.5 gigabit, this one right here, as long as we find out it's not crazy loud. And finally, before we actually go ahead and start this thing up and see how loud it is, it's got a 400 watt budget for PoE. That's a lot. I mean, that is a lot of PoE, so I don't think many people are going to be actually hitting that cap, especially since these are only PoE+ ports. You can basically have 10 of them running at full tilt and still be fine. I think most deployments of this will be able to fill it up with PoE devices and not hit that cap, because very rarely do you have devices operating 100% at the PoE max pull, and a lot of security cameras are not even PoE+, they're just PoE. And so that should be fine. Oh, one other fun thing I just found. On the back here, it's actually got a locking power supply. So right here, it can go ahead and actually lock the power supply in, which can be really nice, especially if you don't want somebody accidentally unplugging your switch, considering how these only have one power supply. So technically this does have 2 different ways you can power it, but it's not dual power supplies. It is not that. So in industry, dual power supplies generally means there's 2 hot swappable power supplies. So if one of them actually dies, you can easily keep the entire thing running 0 downtime and swap it out without shutting the thing down at all. That's because power supplies tend to be a thing that fails and actually are very easy to replace. In all my years, I've never actually had a power supply die, but when you're working on enterprise and an hour of downtime can cost thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, yeah, you want to go through and have dual power supplies on everything just because it's so crucial. UniFi's version of that is this right here. It is a DC input. So you basically buy this separate DC converter that goes through and hooks up to all your UniFi switches. And it's not dual power supplies. It is not equivalent to that. For one, if a power supply dies, okay, you can't replace it. You can't just hot swap the thing and get it going again, which is one of the real advantages of the dual power supplies, is they're hot swappable. You never have to shut the thing down. And 2, the DC power supply, it will only keep it running as long as it never gets shut down. But as soon as it gets shut down, you need an AC power supply in there to boot it up. So that means that you're hoping while the replacement parts are coming in, that you don't have to shut it down for any reason. And so it really is just a non-starter for me. If you already have the UniFi deployment, I mean, maybe if you really don't want downtime, but you're okay with a little bit, it's not the worst thing. It's got to be a heck of a lot cheaper than actually having full-on dual power supplies in there, because that's just a very expensive component. To make them hot swappable is very difficult. But it's not full-on to dual power supplies. It's just not. But having the locking power supply is still quite nice. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and boot this thing up and let's see how it goes. All right, so I've just gone through, quickly basically adopted into my network. And now we are going to do a bit of a noise test here. So I'm going to go ahead and plug it in and we'll go ahead and listen. I do want to give a couple of disclaimers here, just based off of anytime you hear noise on video, it's not noise that you experience. So some noise is filtered out because of the frequency hums. And so it's times where you will sometimes hear it in person a lot louder than it is on camera. Especially, I think actually YouTube has a bit of denoising that it just does without really telling people. And so that's something you kind of need to be aware of. A lot of times you just kind of have to trust whoever's reviewing it, so in this case myself, onto how loud the actual thing is, because the person's experience is going to be completely different than how you hear it in some cases. And so whenever I'm trying to review a loudness thing, I do try to ground it in other basically real things. And so it's kind of hard. I'm going to try to say how loud it is compared to some other UniFi switches, but that's what it is. I will go ahead and plug it in now and be quiet so you can hear exactly how it sounds. The directional microphone is right here, and so it should also be picking up the exact same noise as if you were standing right here. Maybe a little bit more on me than the switch, but it's decently close. All right, it's not booted yet, so since you haven't heard anything, it is still booting. And the fans have not turned on yet, so since you can't hear anything, that's why. All right, and yeah, that's the fan noise. So this is it under zero load. And so what I would describe it as is a much lower frequency than normal. So normally switches and other devices kind of a this is a and so it's definitely audible. It is much more audible than pretty much any other switch, but it's not necessarily loud. It's one of those things where since it's so low frequency as well, you're actually going to hear it a lot further than it would be if it was a bit higher of a pitch, just because of the way that sound waves are broken up through the atmosphere. And so I'd say if this was like in your living room, you would definitely be able to hear it even if it's not next to you. You'd definitely be able to kind of notice it subconsciously especially. And so for me, one thing that was kind of weird for me is I've got UniFi's 12-port SFP Plus and 4-port 10 gig RJ45, which is an awesome switch, except you can hear it. It's probably the exact same amount of noise as this switch right here. And so one thing I experienced was we had a power outage. And so when the switch turned off, it was really weird because it had been in my living room the entire time and I just got used to it. It was remarkable how quiet it is. This is certainly not loud. This is also zero load, so I've got some PoE devices. I'm gonna plug it into it. Nothing major. It's probably not even going to be more than 30 watts, but we'll go ahead and try it out to see how much it adds to it. I have heard under higher loads, this thing does get a bit noisier, but unfortunately I just do not have enough PoE devices right now to really get that much noise. So I'm gonna go start plugging things in and we'll go ahead and I'll give you the max budget on this. All right, so I only have about 7 watts according to this dashboard being pulled right now. I do have very short Ethernet cables and it already has stepped up to a higher amount of draw. So it is a bit louder, and I do think that honestly you are going to start hearing it, especially if you have longer cable runs, because the longer the cable run is, the more that the actual device will have to output, because electricity is dissipated over a larger distance. And so I do think that this will just get louder and louder the more devices you've got. Right now, with only about 2% PoE utilization of its total max capacity, the fans have already started to kick up. And so I do imagine it will just get louder and louder from there. You can hear the fans actually do start to really get loud. I mean, 100% you're probably not gonna be at that often, especially in a cooler area, but you can definitely start to hear it around 50 is where it starts getting kind of louder than you would like, unless it's gonna be closed off. Unfortunately, I just do not have enough devices right now to really see that fan curve. I'm gonna try to see if anybody else has actually been able to figure out the fan curve for the total PoE pull versus fan RPM. That's just a limitation in my setup right now. And so a lot of times what UniFi will do on their non-enterprise switches is they'll actually tell you the exact fan curve, basically in decibels, how loud a switch is based off of how much PoE draw it's got, as well as what the external temperature is. And this one did not, and I don't think any of the enterprise ones do. I think it's because they're like, well, it's enterprise, we can make it as loud as we'd like to. It's still not bad. I mean, you take a normal enterprise switch, and this is dead silent. I mean, a lot of enterprise switches are just screaming, even though they don't need to be. And so it doesn't do that. And it's got a fan curve that automatically gets adjusted, which is nice. But if you start having a lot of PoE devices, I do think you are going to start to hear it, and it's going to be uncomfortable at times, unless it's in a closed off room. Now I will say, if you close a door, you're not hearing this thing. And so that is good. Maybe you'll hear it if you're right up against the door and it's got a high fan. But it's pretty silent if you do close it in. But if you don't, this is probably not gonna be wife approved if you have a high PoE draw. Right now, wife factor approved, or for me, fiance factor approved. I could probably get away with it. But she did say if the box is still in the living room by February 1st, she's putting it out in the garage. So I do worry about that. All right, well, that's gonna be it for this overview of the Switch. Go ahead and leave any other devices you'd like to see me test out in the comments below, or any other tutorials. Always looking for more of those, especially in UniFi. All right, have a good one. Bye. $10%. 20%. 30%. 50% is where you really start to hear it. And that's 100%.